Russia's Ministry of Defence claims it's identified the missile which brought down Malaysian Airlines Flight MH17 4 years ago. Comparisons of registration numbers coupled with audio intercepts point to Ukraine's apparent direct involvement. For more on this, let's speak to our correspondent Igor Zhdanov at the Ministry now. Igor, thanks for joining us. You've been across the story. What conclusions have the Russian investigators arrived at?
Well, Daniel, essentially what the Russian Defense Ministry have done, they took the official serial numbers provided by the official investigation, by the joint investigative team that they found on the debris from the site of the downing of the MH17 Boeing. And the rocket which essentially the official investigation blamed for the downing of this passenger jet. And they searched for the mentions of that serial number in their own archived documents. And what happened, the Russian Defense Ministry apparently found the actual passport of that very missile. The passport has all sorts of information. It essentially tracks the whole life cycle of this rocket from the point when it was manufactured and which army unit was armed with that rocket. And here's what they found out. Have a listen.
Дата сборки ракеты с заводским серийным номером.
The manufacture date of the missile is the 24th of December 1986. It was transported by train to the military base 20152. Today this base, which still uses missiles of this type, is in the Ukrainian district of Lvov. And since then, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the missile never returned to the territory of Russia.
The passport and all other relevant documents were actually brought to the room. In fact, they used to be top secret, and the Russian Defense Ministry have unclassified them for the sake of the probe, for the sake of the investigation. They also passed on all the data on the rocket to the official investigation, and they are saying they are open to everybody, to any inquiries, any further questions that the official investigation may have. In fact, even us journalists had a chance to have a look with our own eyes at these papers. Also, the second part of the presentation by the Russian Defense Ministry included some footage analyzed before by the joint investigative team, and the Russian Defense Ministry says basically they've shown their examples of how they believe that footage was tampered with. And the third part was also a very interesting one, and they purported to play to us an audio recording which the Russian Defense Ministry says is a conversation between a Ukrainian colonel with another officer, and a lot of F-bombs dropped in that recording, unedited by the Russian Defense Ministry for the very purpose of showing that they themselves did not tamper with the recording. And this is the key bit from it.
Возьми этого керівника, возьми Левчука и скажи: пацаны, вот если будет вот так, то еще один малазийский Боинг, и все будет. Все, вот так говори, по-другому не надо говорить.
Well, this colonel has been identified as one of the officers who is taking part in what Kiev authorities are calling the anti-terrorist operation in east of Ukraine. Now, all of that is according to the Russian Defense Ministry, of course. Now, so right now, all of this again has been passed on to the official investigation, and the Russian Defense Ministry are saying that they are ready to take any further questions and they are ready to share more information with the investigators.
Certainly a new, interesting turn in this investigation. Igor, thanks for keeping across the story there. RT's Igor Zhdanov. Well, to discuss this further now, let's bring in security analyst and former UK Army officer Charles Shoebridge. Thanks for joining us, Charles. Great to have you with us, as always. How do you expect the international investigation team to react to this new evidence from the Defence Ministry?
Well, on the face of it, this is very important new evidence that's been presented by the Russian Defense Ministry. It's only just been released. We're going to have to look at it in great detail. And, of course, that's going to be the position that the Joint Investigation Team will, I'm sure, take. They will be keen to look at it and also be keen to be seen to be looking at this evidence very closely. It's a fairly obvious piece of evidence, actually, that I imagine the JIT have been expecting to receive, or at least have wanted to receive. The fact that they were able to identify the missile concerned through at least partial or full serial numbers. Of course, the next obvious step would be to trace and track what happened with that missile from the point of its manufacture to the point of its destruction or deployment or scrapping. And that's what the Russians seem to have been able to have done by filling in that missing picture. Also, the other evidence is very, very important because largely what the joint investigation team in the Netherlands based largely its conclusions on was that there was an evidence trail of an image evidence trail of a Russian Buk launcher going from Russian territory into Ukraine territory and then back again minus its missile. Now, that was provided largely by the so-called investigative website Bellingcat. It's, of course, marketed by itself, branded as an independent body, but, of course, anybody that follows it closely, as myself and many others do, will see that it always takes a very pro-US, UK side, no matter what field it's looking at. But nonetheless, that evidence it provided was important and, on the face of it, very compelling. Now, today, the Russian Ministry of Defense has said that it believes that that evidence was digitally manipulated. Now, that's going to take some time to analyse their findings to establish the strength of that evidence. But once again, that is going to be very important evidence for the joint investigation team in the Netherlands who've taken the lead in investigating this matter for them to look at. And we will, of course, await their findings with some interest.
I just want to ask you about the audio recording, Charles. Very interesting. They said it featured a Ukrainian colonel talking to a fellow serviceman saying, quote, "We could bring down another Boeing." Now, if you remember, in the early days and weeks after this tragedy, the Ukrainian side released their audio recordings, allegedly of Russian or Russian-backed rebels in the eastern Ukraine, talking about the same thing. So both sides are releasing various intercepts. What did you make of it? I mean, I suppose questions are going to be asked as to why it's taken 4 years for the Russian side to produce this.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And they will have to come up with some answer for that. But also, of course, if you're going to manipulate that or digitally create it, in other words, fabricate that recording, of course, that also wouldn't take 4 years. And so there might be some administrative reason for that, or perhaps the significance of it wasn't appreciated until now. Again, verifying these audio recordings is a lot more difficult than verifying, for example, radar monitoring recordings and so on that can have some third-party corroboration present, for example, air traffic control records. But where it's just been produced through secret information, it basically comes down to intelligence services say. Now, of course, that can also be corroborated, if you like, by voice print analysis and so on, if the person who is allegedly identified in this can come forward or at least have some voice sample analysed. But I think in today's disclosures, the far more important evidence, I suspect, for the GIT will be especially the serial number concern, because people like myself from the very outset have been keen to point out Ukraine and Russia have the Buk and missile, as well as other countries. So therefore, in that field of operations, it could have come from either country, notwithstanding the other evidence concerned. And also, of course, the key element from the point of view of so-called Russian guilt being found was this photograph trail that Bellingcat website produced. And if that is undermined, that is very important, not only for this investigation, but also, of course, for everything else that Bellingcat produces.
I just want to come back briefly to the documents you mentioned. As you said, it's a very key piece of evidence, that serial number. And I suppose you wonder why that wasn't, again, looked at and traced earlier to the origins of where that missile was produced, where it was based. Russia says Ukraine will have copies of the documents, similar documents as well, obviously tracking the whereabouts of this missile. Do you think Kiev will produce those?
I think it's very unlikely that Kiev will, produce evidence that implicates itself. Of course, it could argue that during the turbulent times around the bringing down of MH17, of course, there was a fairly high-intensity conflict going on in that region. And it may well be that, of course, as I argued at the time, as a possibility, nothing more than that, that the rebels in those areas could have actually seized a Ukrainian Buk, and then, therefore, even if it was a Ukrainian missile, could have still been brought down, albeit accidentally, it would appear, by rebels. But Ukraine denied that and has consistently said it wasn't missing any of its Buk missiles. And so, therefore, of course, if it turns out that now this was a Ukrainian missile, even if it was then subsequently alleged that the rebels actually seized this themselves, that argument is now undermined by the Ukraine authorities' assertion at the time that they had not lost any Buk missiles. And so I think it's unlikely that they would admit this, but they should still be able to produce document trails for all of the other Buk missiles that Ukraine regiments received during their time as part of the Soviet Union.
I just want to touch briefly on the sort of political aspect of this tragedy. And of course, there's been wide political, economic fallout over the last few years over this. But just as Russia's defense ministry was giving that press conference, presenting that evidence, Ukraine announced that it's nullifying the treaty on friendship, cooperation and partnership between UK and the Russian Federation, both former Soviet states. Do you think that's a coincidence, or is it some sort of response to Moscow presenting its version of events, its new findings?
Again, we've talked about why hasn't this emerged before, and you wonder why Ukraine hasn't revoked this, or even why Russia hasn't revoked it. Of course, the practical reality is that notwithstanding that, for the rest of the world, it appears that these two countries, the Russian Federation and Ukraine, are at each other's throats. Of course, they are still very important trading partners. Economically, there are close links. And so, of course, whilst on the face of it, they are very antagonistic towards one another, behind the scenes, some level of cooperation has to continue. And so that would probably explain that. Everything, of course, involved from the Russian side, from the Ukrainian side, from the UK, US side, has the input of so-called information management professionals, PR people. So I'm sure there's been some input to this announcement from Ukraine to try and distract attention from this. But really, of course, the Ukrainian media, if they're free to do so, of course, should be now asking questions. Well, let's see, the Ukrainian authorities now need to be able to rebut and refute these allegations from Russia, and let's see if they actually do that. They are able to do it. Of course, they can't produce the document trail for a missile that they would say they never own, but what they can do is show the document trail for all the other missiles that came, which would show that actually this missile wasn't part of that original consignment, because the numbers and types of missiles that were deployed in Ukraine or were actually part of Ukrainian units, subsequently the Ukrainian armed forces, will still be known. Those documents will still exist.
OK, security analyst, former UK Army officer Charles Shoebridge, thanks for your expert insight today on that latest evidence from the Russian MoD.